Well, hello. Welcome, Lambert. How are you doing?
Hi, Eva. Hey, Sebastian. Nice to see you here.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah, I know Eva has been looking forward to this episode for a long time. And the more I prepped for this, the more I understood why. And so very excited to talk to you. Um, Eva, I know you had many thoughts. Where do you want to go first today?
Well, I think let's just splash right into it, and then we'll start exploring it from different angles. We've now done also a few episodes already around the international credits and EU's 2040 climate target, and the conversations I've had around this. It's oftentimes around the potential role of Article 6.4 and 6.2, and then you kind of quickly start talking about which credits are better. And at the same time, we already are supposed to use at least some credits towards our current NDC, and these are the CRCF credits. And I thought it would be so great to have a session with you, Lambert, to really figure out what kind of credits ultimately should we allow to be used against EU's climate targets, and like what should be the guiding principles. So can you start opening it up? Like what
That's
are
a big question.
the basics?
Yeah, it's a big topic, but let's try to break it down. So I think what would be great is to talk like to different dimensions, right? One is the classical, really one, carbon credit quality. So additionality, quantification, non-permanence. We all know these very well. But then there are other dimensions, like, for example, sharing of mitigation outcomes with host countries, so that the host countries don't have perverse incentives not to set ambitious NDCs, but that they really get part of the emission reductions for themselves to achieve their NDC. Or nerdy other topics like accounting, like Article 6 offers different accounting options for single year targets. And there are problems if you choose a certain one, right? So there are the core principles around really quality and should we use the PACM mechanism or not. And then there are a number of other criteria which are not directly related to the quality of the credits, but which are also really important, I think.
Should we dive into quality? Because I'm sure we could easily fill half an hour, but let's try to be punchy. On the quality side, if you think about the different mechanisms, I know you've published a lot about, the CRCF, Article 6, all the others. How do you see the quality criteria stacking up when you're thinking about the EU's NDC?
I personally think from what we see so far that the PACM, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, is really a new benchmark for quality. I'm involved. I'm part of the methodological expert panel, so maybe I'm biased. But I think what I see, what is happening there, really tries to avoid some of the mistakes of the past and set a higher benchmark. So just to maybe provide some concrete examples, like I think a lot of the quantification problems, they come from dealing with uncertainty. And so what this mechanism does right, and what actually also the ICVCM has a criterion, is you should take all uncertainties into account, like from assumptions, from models, from your baseline, from quantification, etc. And then you take all of these into account, and then you arrive at a conservative quantification. And I think that hasn't always been done systematically. And I think what the PACM is trying is to do that in a systematic manner. That's one example of, I think, where the PACM really differs from how things have been approached in the voluntary carbon market.
But there has been some criticism towards PACM that for some activities, in this case it's mostly emission reduction activities, that their methodologies are becoming so strict that it's unlikely that there's going to be enough motivation to use them because other methodologies that already exist are, basically you can get more credits for the same activity. Like, how do you look at this? Obviously, this shouldn't be why one or the other methodology is being used, but that criticism seems to be, kind of taking ground.
Yeah, I think it's clear you will get less credits probably if you apply PACM. I mean, we only have one methodology so far, which is for landfill gas. But for that methodology, clearly you get less credits than if you apply probably any other methodology in the market. But I think there have been problems with that methodology for overcrediting methane oxidation factors, like really some technical details. And I think the solution is that higher prices will need to be paid. And I hope that for the PACM, that buyers realize, okay, this has a different standard. It's aligned with the Paris Agreement. It has higher quality. And so we are willing, if we want to set this quality benchmark, we are willing to pay higher prices. And I think really, I found it interesting when I was at the COP, one of leading African negotiator known by many people, Mbaye Diagne, like he really made the point in the negotiation room when this criticism came up. He said, well, that's not the solution. It's really that buyers have to pay higher prices, but continuing with a lower standard is not the answer for making projects viable. But it's really, okay, you get less credits, but then you need higher prices.
So PACM is one of the potential mechanisms that keeps getting referred to. The other one is Article 6.2. And what I have heard that the Commission might be thinking about is using Article 6.2 mechanism whilst using the methodologies under PACM. What do you think about that approach?
Yeah, I think maybe first, I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding around 6.2 and 6.4. So if the EU wants to use ITMOs to achieve its NDC, right, it always needs to use 6.2 because 6.2 provides the accounting framework, etc. And then the question is more, you use 6.2, but what is the mechanism under which you generate the carbon credits? And so that can be the PACM or gold standard or VCS or whatever. And so if you use articles, if people say you use only Article 6.2, my question is always, yeah, but how do you generate the credits, right? Then you still need a mechanism or a rule set to generate the credits. And so you still need to pick one. You can't use 6.2 alone, or you create your own rule book, right? And so Given that we have 20 years of experience, of course, the EU could create, as Japan did with the joint crediting mechanism, they could create their own bilateral mechanism and invent their own rules. But I think so much work has now been done in that. So at least it makes sense if the EU wants to use their own rules to build on what's already there and to look at ICVCM, at the PACM, like at the different standards and say, okay, what are the rules? But then, yeah, if you also go to specific methodologies, it's such a time to develop your own methodologies rather than using existing ones. It could also lead to a lot of delay and cost to do that. So I think the EU should either decide, okay, we use the PACM, or decide something like we set our own benchmark and then we determine which methodologies are eligible from the different existing standards. But I'm not sure that the EU should start writing its own new methodologies.
Then in some settings they do, right, when it comes to the CRCF. And
before
you have
we
had...
go... Okay, before we go to the CRCF, can I ask one more question? I know that because we're going to go down a rabbit hole there. So on PACM, one thing that I have seen come up more and more in the last couple of weeks and months is concern around the ability to develop and especially maintain some of these methodologies. So more kind of structural, limitations that the body might have compared to other players, even the CRCF as a mechanism, for example, and how it's set up. So given that you're really deep in it, I wanted to ask you, like, how confident do you feel on that? Because if you were to peg its 6.2 to PACM, we need to make sure that there's really the ability to deliver and continually update these methodologies.
No, yeah, that's a good question. And I kind of share the concern, like until before the COP, it was not even clear whether the Article 6.4 mechanism will have funds for next year, right? And then at the COP, it was decided to transfer all the CDM money. And kind of if I think people are really working hard under the mechanism, but to draft hundreds of methodologies, which we will need over time, right? You had under the CDM, that took a long time. And even revising the CDM methodologies takes time. Of course, there's something you can build upon, but the idea is really to make them Paris-aligned. And so it takes time. And there are also capacity constraints with the secretariat, with the methodological expert panel. Yeah, so it will take a couple of years until you have a broad set of methodologies, I think.
That was a great question. So
Over to the CRCF.
Let's move on to the CRCF, because that's an example where the EU has gone on and developed its own methodologies, right? It's basically kind of an EU's standards. It's looking only at removals and very limited types of emission reductions. You have looked and you have compared actually the work of under CRCF with other meta standards and PACM. So how like, what's your take? Is there something that you could take over from its CRCF work also when it comes to allowing in international credits? Should something be changed? What do you think?
Yeah, I must say I'm very disappointed with that process and the outcome. I think the CRCF methodologies, they really set a lower standard than most what you have. Like in many instances, also lower standard than VCS, for example. And so I don't understand what the Commission is really doing there. Because on international level, the EU is really demanding for these highest standards, and then we are inventing a domestic mechanism which is kind of, if you look to the methodologies, they really read like the early days of carbon crediting, like also in terms of terminology, they sometimes use different terms than what is commonly established for the same thing. And you're wondering, well, we have already lots of tools on this. Why do they name this differently? And then, yeah, I mean, on substance, I think the quantification, the additionality, like all of the issues are really problematic. Maybe to make it specific, like for example, most carbon crediting standards have some rules on retroactive crediting, right? The PACM says, okay, you need to have these prior notification requests, etc. And the initial methodologies, like they had barely any limit. Like you could go back to the past and say, well, I've planted this forest 5 or 10 years ago, and now I get credits. And it's like no financial policymaker would design a program where you reward something for a private actor who took a decision years ago, and retroactively you reward something. So yeah, I mean, there's this clause, I think in the in the CRCF directive that it should be Article 6 aligned at some point. And why don't you do that from scratch, I would say, right? And the argument I hear is, well, it's for domestic purposes, it's not for international purposes, so it's a different context. But we looked into that, and I think that argument really only holds for very few criteria. Like, of course, the corresponding adjustment you don't need. You could argue whether you need a downward adjustment to the baseline, like that's a Paris alignment. But for the rest, of course, you care for additionality. You want to steer the money to those projects that need them and not just give to everybody. And of course, you want that a ton is a ton if you want these credits to be used in the ETS or elsewhere. And so I think this argument, it's different because it's in Europe and not an international mechanism. I can't really see that.
Can I ask you something? Because I reread at the time, but I reread with great interest what you wrote in May. And I think kind of the most scathing quote, right, is the vast majority of CRCF units will not represent any actual emission reductions or removals. And one question, this was May. There has been supposedly quite a lot of progress since May. Has your assessment changed in any way?
over or not, I mean, what I have to say, like what we have now is the permanent removals, right? They are we're in the consultation process, and we are waiting for the Commission to have the final proposal. And so for the permanent removals, some of the risks are lower, right? So for example, for bio-CCS or DAX, it's quite clear it's additional because it's so expensive. And so the whole risk of additionality is lower. But the rules were more or less the same across the methodologies, and the rules are still not good. So I would say for the permanent removals which are now there, the main risk I see is really on biomass. Like the whole biomass accounting, that's really a severe risk for both bio-CCS and biochar. The other things are less bad, but then if you take the same rule set and you later apply them to afforestation or to storage of carbon in buildings, you will get a lot of non-additional activities. And so, yeah, it's a question like, do these methodologies set a precedent also for how of some of the other methodologies things will be addressed, or will they take stricter approaches on additionality, for example, when it comes to the land use sector?
Yeah, this is really interesting feedback, because when the Commission set out developing these methodologies, I think the plan was that we don't want to use what already exists because that's not good enough, and we want to create something that's better, that's of higher quality, and ideally, influence the rest of the carbon markets with this potentially greater standards. And then in reality, it doesn't always hold up to what actually was the idea behind it. But why I reached out to you, Lambert, to have this conversation was because some of the conversations I had in Brussels kind of brought together this, international credits under Article 6 against the 2040 target, and meanwhile there are other credits, yes, domestic ones, that are also already based on the CRCF regulation to be used towards the EU's NDC, and that kind of, then it dawned on me, we're talking about using different types of credits, but be it international or domestic, towards EU's own climate targets. And shouldn't there be similar criteria if we talk about it? Because somehow these two are always looked at in isolation. And that's where I would like to explore. So if the EU were to develop some kind of blueprints for the quality or criteria for credits that could be used towards EU's climate targets, where should they start, and how to actually bring us out of this mess where we have two quite separate playbooks right now?
Yeah, I really don't know how to get out of that mess.
Really?
But I agree. In principle, it should be the same, I think, right? I mean, you could argue, as I said before, the downward adjustment. There may be some elements where you could argue why domestically the rules could be a little bit different, but not for the main criteria. So, I mean, I think it's also important to look to the 6.2 rules, why they are really vague. They have some principles like baselines below business as usual is one of the principles in 6.2. Yeah, so I frankly, I think the CRCF wouldn't pass that at the moment, how it's drafted. It wouldn't even pass the 6.2 rules, so it couldn't be used as a mechanism to purchase international credits. Then the EU would risk that in expert reviews under Article 6, the EU would get questions. Does it comply with the 6.2 rules? As Switzerland is getting questions for its bilateral cooperation, the EU would as well, right? And so I think the EU should really go for a higher standard, and that's what the EU has been calling for internationally.
Yeah, and those first reports were quite damning, especially for when I read the Swiss one. Yeah.
And I mean, next year we do have a review of the CRCF. Do you feel that it's possible to make some of those changes, or do you feel they're so systemic, so large, that even a review will not be able to address these?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's a question of political will. How much pressure member states will make on and Parliament will make on the European Commission to take this seriously. I mean, so far, I think we also have submitted a lot of comments to the process, and we haven't really seen. We have seen that some of the comments have been taken on board, and we have seen some improvements to the methodologies, but in core elements, I think they haven't been changed. And to take this issue on accounting for biomass, where also, to my knowledge, several member states really said this should change, right? And then in the draft, like so far, I think it hasn't really changed from what I've heard. And I think there are still internal debates about that, but I'm really curious to see what will come out of that and whether they change that approach. Because just on this biomass accounting, that was already more ambitious under the CDM, right? So there the rules already 20 years ago were drafted in a way that is more cautious. And the risk here is maybe just to explain, the risk is if you use the biomass elsewhere and you divert it to a CRCF activity, then maybe elsewhere you use more fossil fuels, and then you just shift emissions from one place to the other, but you don't actually reduce emissions. And that I could see as a major risk. And then if I may, just a thought. Just one more thought, because also what I very often hear, or from some players, then they argue, but if you have leakage, it will be accounted within the EU. And that's true, but then it makes it more difficult for the EU to achieve its target. So because it's a EU domestic mechanism, and if you don't quantify appropriately, you could say the greenhouse gas inventories will still show the truth. And so the EU doesn't betray any international rules. It still does proper accounting. I agree. But then the EU has a risk of not achieving its target because it uses credits maybe in the EU ETS or elsewhere, right? Or it puts money into credits which do not actually represent actual emission reductions. And then the counting at the EU level is still right. But the EU doesn't get the emission reductions it's expecting from the mechanism. And that's also an implementation problem then.
Is there anything else we still want to cover on CRCF, Sebastian, before we move, I would say, back to the international credits?
I mean, one thing that's maybe linked, that would be my last question, is in the CRCF, permanence is defined for durable removals as several centuries, right? And I was just wondering, how does that stack up for you? Like, is permanence in the CRCF also an issue for you? Do we need more than that? Is that fine? But then, happy to move to the other dimension, maybe on the back of this question.
Yeah, no, I think permanence is actually the one area where the CRCF is quite good, at least for the permanent removals, right? Because you need to replace any reversals with ETS allowances. And so I think that's the one area where it's at least as stringent as the PACM, or maybe even more stringent. So I'm not so concerned with that. But then there are the temporary units for the carbon farming activities where nobody still understands what they actually are, right? What does it mean you have temporary sequestration, and does it mean replacement? I mean, that's an own topic on its own, but it's still not clear how permanence is addressed for these, I think.
Okay.
So coming back to international credits and using those against the EU's climate target, or in this case, we talk about 2040 target, right? Not the 2035 NDC at this point. What would make the most sense? When I listen to you, it sounds to me that PACM would be a great way to go. The problem is that doesn't really have methodologies at this point, so there's going to be less to play around with. Of course, 2040 is still quite time, in the future. we're in 2025. Yeah, we could potentially have 10 years to get more methodologies developed. But is there, like, would you use, for example, PACM plus some specific EU's own criteria on top of it? Because you've worked on carbon credits and their quality for a long time, so you know what's best. What's best?
Yeah, I think one caveat is also that, I mean, at the moment, PACM is pretty good, I would say, but also we don't know how it will develop, right? We don't know how it will look in 5 years. So I think there are two options for the EU. One would be, okay, we want PACM credits, full stop. And then the advantage of that is you are sure that they comply with all the detailed rules of the PACM. Another option would be we use a PACM similar benchmark. So we develop our own benchmark, and which is based maybe on PACM, which has maybe some additional elements, but which is our own benchmark. And then we evaluate, like the ICVCM, like COSIR, we evaluate, okay, which are the methodologies, the programs, the type of activities that are eligible. And so the EU would then decide, okay, we have an assessment process similar to ICVCM or ICAO. And then at the end, we arrive and we say, this gold standard methodology is eligible, this one is not, etc. I think that would still be better than writing your own methodologies, in my view. Of course, that's the third option that the EU has. Like, the EU can really establish its own international mechanism based on its own methodologies, develop everything also by themselves from scratch. So that's the 3 levels I can imagine, like use PACM, use an ICVCM COSIR process and define which programs, methodology, combinations, activity types are eligible, or develop your own standards. What do you think? I'm also curious what of these would work.
Could it then be, because I mean ICVCM, right, exists. It has its rule book in place. It sounds like one way forward is just deciding what types of activities the EU actually wants to see being supported through these credits, and then do you think it needs to look at PACM still through the lens of ICVCM, for example? Or is that also not going to be enough and something should be done on top of that?
What do you mean when you say looking at ICVCM through the lens of PACM? Like
the other way around. Basically, looking at different methodologies under PACM, but then making sure that they are all also basically they will be the CCP eligible under ICVCM, because it's not a given at this point, I guess, right?
Yeah. I mean, what I find interesting is, like, if you look to some of the details of the PACM requirements in the ICVCM, there's some overlap, and some are even identical word by word. So it's clear that the PACM has also drawn on ICVCM as it has on CDM, on many other what is out there existing. I think one issue for me with the ICVCM is one issue is to have the rule set, and the other issue is to follow through on it. So in my personal assessment, some of the categories, the carbon credit types which are eligible under the ICVCM, they don't fully fulfill the ICVCM requirements, right? And so that's what I see. I think the ICVCM is really important. It's really good. It established a good standard. But in my personal opinion, they are not fully following through on their own rules. And so I think the EU shouldn't necessarily rely on these results, but in developing its own benchmark, it could look at ICVCM, it could look at the PACM, it could look at the Oxford Principles for Responsible Engagement with Article 6. I mean, there are lots of frameworks out there which one could draw upon.
Excellent. Any burning question ever? Otherwise, I think this was a great overview
Well,
to
I
end
will
it on.
just ask for a quick one at the end. We are basically almost at time. So, good or bad, this idea of allowing international credits to be used against the 2040 climate target?
I think it would have been good if the EU had said, we really raise ambition, meaning we become climate neutral by 2040, by 2045, and we use international carbon credits to do that, right? Now it's a little bit like the EU is still having the same target, but using international credits. And that wasn't the idea of Article 6. I mean, of course, some people say we wouldn't have had the 90% targets without Article 6. We would have had a lower target. But it's I think when I was at the COP, it was really we had this ambition dialogue, and that was a thing that was said very often, like that many NGOs, many people criticized. We have the impression Article 6 is being used as a flexibility mechanism to lower costs and not necessarily as a mechanism to raise a lot of ambition. And that was a key theme at the COP, really, in the ambition dialogue.
So interesting. We'll need to have you back on. That's for sure. But yeah.
Very, very insightful. Thank you so much for joining us, Lambert. Thanks for taking the time. I learned a lot, and I'm sure many listeners will do.
Thank you. Have a good evening, Lambert.
Thanks for the invitation. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.